Hello, Petal. How are you today? I've got a little while before I have to crack on for the day, so I thought I'd get this one done and then we can catch up and have another one later on. But what I will do is post them as soon as they're rendered, so there we go. Thank you again for your patience and understanding. You guys are amazing and I truly appreciate you very, very much. How's your week been so far? How are you doing? How are you getting on? Is everything going okay? Has the spring sprung? I don't keep going on about it, but I haven't actually seen spring sprung, and it's supposed to have been the hottest one on record, the hottest March on record. But I'm like, where? But it's okay because I've been having a lovely rainy week and it's been cleaning the world down ready for spring, and I'm just looking for the flowers to start popping. The little body popping out the window. Very nice. Okay, so as ever, if you enjoy it, if you could hit the like button, hit the notifications bell, share and subscribe if you don't. It helps the channel, it helps me keep doing what I do. And we are on May Contain Traces of Magic, J.W. Wells & Co., Book 6. The 5 of the chapter of 5. Let's get cracking. And you're sure it was her? Jill said, for the 5th time. You're sure? Absolutely, Chris replied, stifling a yawn. I'd know her voice anywhere. It's been telling me where to go for the last 5 months. Jill's office wasn't a bit like he'd imagined. He'd had this mental picture of something out of an American cop show, the 14th Precinct or whatever. Open plan bustle, men in shirt sleeves, phones ringing, a Brownian commotion of activity. But no, it was small. The building used to be an ordinary mid-Victorian house, Jill had told him, and her bit of it had been a boiler room, and cluttered, with filing cabinets jostling around her desk like gawpers at an accident scene. There were piles of green, blue and beige folders all over her desk, the windowsill, and the floor. She had a computer and a phone, a stapler, and a Darth Vader coffee mug, and in one corner there was an umbrella stand, crammed with weapons. He'd been trying not to stare at them ever since she'd brought him in. Sorry, Jill said, but I'd like to go through the sequence of events just one more time. I'm sure I must be missing something. There was an axe, for example, and a sledgehammer, 2 short spears and a variety of different swords, straight and curved, long, short, thick and thin, and a big slashy sort of thing with a very peculiar lettering on the blade, and something that looked like a saw on a stick. We got lost, Chris said wearily. I got us lost. I'm not much good at maps. That's strange, she interrupted. In your line of work, I mean. I'd have thought you must have got quite good at reading maps. You haven't always had a delicacy of feeling, he assumed, made her tail off before actually saying the S word. I managed, he replied, and after a bit you keep going to the same places. You know the way, you don't need a map. Jill's eyebrow raised a little. That's another thing, she said. You've got your set rounds, right? And, like you say, you know how to get to them. You could probably find your way around your routes with your eyes shut. So, why did you need to use the... He broke eye contact and didn't reply. It's all right, she said nicely. You aren't the first person it's happened to, you know. And it's important that we understand exactly how close the link between you and it was. You see, the closer the link, the worse the obsession is, if they get loose. If you only used it, say, once a month, it'd be hard for it to find you. But if you used it every day... She looked at Chris as she said it. He nodded. If you used it every day, Jill repeated, it sort of gets tuned into you, and it can hone in on you really easily, which I guess explains how she found you. Chris grinned sadly. My own stupid fault, in other words. You can see it like that if you want to, she replied, but I don't. Personally, I think they can be very dangerous things, and there ought to be strict controls on how they're sold. But, she added, with a shrug, the people who matter don't agree with me, or at least not yet, so there we go. Anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go on with what you were saying. So he went through it yet again, while Jill made them both a coffee with the kettle perched on a crag of folders. The car park, Angela's sudden disappearance, the demon, the threats, the pain. Where is she? All that. And it was just about to kill me, Chris said, when she turned up. There was a photo of Jill's mum and dad on the desk, buried among the paperwork like miners trapped in a cave-in. He barely recognised them because of the dust on the glass. It does seem like a bit of a coincidence, Jill said. Not for the very first time. He shrugged. Yes, he said. It does rather. Anyway, I couldn't see what was going on, but I'm pretty sure she fought the demon because it screamed a lot, didn't sound like it was having a very nice time, and when the lights came on, it wasn't there anymore. And she was looking a bit puffed, leaning on the sword thing she had with her. A bit, he couldn't help adding, like that one you've got there, look, wedged in between the meat cleaver and the polo mallet. Jill smiled indulgently. You mean the S-talk, she said, and the meat cleaver's a bardiche, and that's not a polo mallet, it's a martel. You use it for hammering stakes into the hearts of vampires. Oh, quite, she said. Serves you right for asking. Actually, she added, now you mention it, that's quite interesting. If what it had really was an S-talk, Watson, very specialised, she replied. Quite rare, too. The blade is a single hair from the head of a fallen angel. Oh, really? It is, Jill said, with a grin. No kidding. It's given like a really, really heavy relaxing treatment to keep it straight, and it'll cut through pretty much anything. Like a pantocopt, Chris said, without thinking. She gave him ever such a funny look. A bit like a pantocopt, she replied. Only not as good, obviously. She paused. You're pretty well informed, aren't you? Oh, well, Chris replied, trying to sound flippant and feeling. Magic artefacts are my business, so I know a lot of... Not one of JWW Retail's biggest volume lines, though, are they? Or if they are, we really ought to know about it. I read about them in some book, okay? He could feel the conversation starting to seize up, like an unlubricated engine. Stuck in my mind for some reason. They reminded me of lightsabers in Star Wars. What in what? Chris frowned. It's a film, he said. Oh, Jill shrugged. Anyway, she said, if the entity from your SatNav really has managed to get hold of an S-talk, that's not good at all. I'm starting to wonder if it stole it from here, before it broke out. We'll have to do an inventory. Glad you're taking it seriously, he said, bearing in mind it was me she tried to chop up with the bloody thing. Quite. Jill leaned back a little in her chair. She was starting to get a bit of a double chin, he noticed, and her face was a bit rounder than it used to be. About that, you say it attacked you? Chris nodded. Oh, yes, he said, after she'd chased off the demon. He paused, then said, I guess it was my fault. You see, I recognised her voice when she yelled something at the demon, and I told her so. I said, I know who you are, or something like that, and she said, no, I must be wrong, but I insisted, and then she slashed at me with the sword thing. Luckily she missed me, but cut the seat belt, and I fell forward, and, well, there I was in the car park. But it was me insisting I knew who she was that made her go for me. I am sure of it. Jill nodded. You were very lucky, she said, all the way through. In fact, actually, it's amazing you're still here. That's nice to know, Chris growled. Then, look, what exactly did happen to me? You've been asking all these questions, But you haven't told me anything, and I think I've got a right—" "Fair enough," Jill said. "All right, this is what we think happened. Most of it is just speculation, mind. We don't actually know, but the theory is that you were lured there deliberately by the demons because they think you know something." Chris scowled. "They should have talked to Miss Hickey then," he said. "She always reckoned I didn't know anything." "I don't think they're interested in GCSE-level geography," Jill replied. "We do know that it wasn't your trainee that called at your flat. We checked. Her mother said she was in her room all morning working on a research project for her degree course, so she never left the house. What you saw was probably a demon under a glamour." "Oh. No reason why you should have suspected anything," Jill said. "It's fairly basic technology, and just the sort of thing demons are good at. Also, we checked with your Mr. Bernards, and it was the first he'd heard of any of it, so it's definitely looking like a setup, and they wanted you in that car park at that particular time." "I see," Chris said. "Why there?" "Geometaphysical fault line runs slap bang through the middle of the Ettingdale Retail Park," she told him. "Been known about for centuries, but when we told the local planning authority, they just weren't interested. We think the demons chose it because the fault makes it easier to shift a material object. You, for example, out of our dimension into theirs. That and the portable parking space." "What? They used a BB-27. Probably stolen from your car," Jill said, with a commiserating smile. "It's well known that they can cause dimensional interface ruptures. They'll have kept the space empty while they were waiting for you to arrive with some kind of illusion, so the shoppers would have thought the space was taken. The demon, pretending to be Angela, simply parked the car on top of it, and swoosh, there you go." "Hang on, though," Chris said. "We were lost. I got us lost. So how did they know I'd drive us to exactly that?" Another smile. "The map was jinxed," she said. "Again, fairly elementary stuff. It made you go there. So there's one positive thing to come out of all of this. You're not nearly as rubbish at map reading as you thought you were." Chris sighed. "Sort of makes it all seem worthwhile, really." "Quite," Jill laughed. She had, he remembered, always laughed at his jokes. "So the real mystery is," she went on, "what it is that they think you know, and they're so desperate to find out. It must be something really important to them, because all this, the planning, the setup, it's a hell of a lot of trouble for them to go to. Really expensive in terms of energy expended in our dimension, I mean." Chris nodded. "You told me all about that," he said. "Which brings us back to the question," Jill went on, with a sigh. "Who is this she they're so dead keen to find?" "I've been thinking about that," he said. "SatNav, the entity inside my SatNav. She's a she." Jill frowned. "So am I," she said. "Actually, so are a lot of people." "Yes, but maybe she's involved in all this." Chris hesitated. "But surely it couldn't do any harm now, not after SatNav had tried to kill him." "There was one thing I didn't tell you about the other demon, the one yesterday." Her eyes gleamed. "I thought so," she said. "Well?" So he told her how just before it left the car, the demon had reached past him and turned SatNav on with its claw. "And that's all," he concluded lamely. "I didn't tell you at first because I didn't think it was important." "Fibber?" "Right." Chris held up a hand in front of his face. "You're right. I was afraid that if I told you, your people would take her away and break her open or something. I didn't want anything to happen to her." He raised both hands and spread his fingers. Surrender. "You know why, don't you?" Compassion. Compassion in victory, which isn't quite the same thing. "Like I said," Jill replied, "you aren't the first. I don't suppose you'll be the last, and I'm not going to pass judgment. And you've told me now, which is the main thing. And yes," she added, "I do think it's significant. Not absolutely sure why, but I have a feeling about it. Like, it may just answer the really big question that's been bugging both of us." Why you? Chris tried to think, but... All right then, why me? Simply because the thing happened to be banged up in your SatNav, she said. If that's what they're after. It's just a hypothesis at this stage, she added quickly. Barely that, even. Still, half a hypothesis is marginally better than a complete and utter clue deficiency. All right, she said. I think that's everything for now. She glanced at her watch. Lunchtime, she said. I reckon the least the government can do is buy you a pint and a sandwich after screwing up your Saturday. Or would you rather get on home? Be back by 1, Karen had said. Well, no chance of that now. What a pity. On expenses? He queried. Your taxes at work, Jill replied. Tell you what, a pint, a sandwich, and a packet of crisps. We can always make up the budget deficiency by firing a few clerical officers. And, she added, I promise not to say a word about demons or malevolent SatNav entities or geometaphysical rifts. Deal? Jill kept her promise. Instead, they talked about old friends from school, all of whose lives turned out to be either vastly better or immeasurably worse than his own. That left Chris 50% depressed and 50% obnoxiously smug. And 2 pints at lunchtime added a haze of gentle anaesthesia. She paid for his taxi home. The bathroom, he remembered. He was supposed to start stripping off the old wallpaper. The cheerful part of him thought, why not? And the miserable part thought, might as well. So he went into the kitchen to assemble the necessary arsenal. There on the table was the backtalked tape measure. Bloody stupid thing to leave lying about, he told himself sternly. What if Karen had found it and started playing with it? She could have turned herself into salami before she'd realised there was something wrong. He took it into the bedroom and hid it under the bed, out of harm's way. How to strip off wallpaper. First, you get it wet with the stuff from the bottle. This makes it soggy, and then you scrape at it with the scraper. Chris had never been any good at it, but it hadn't mattered when he was young, because one of Grandad's friends from the factory came round and did it by magic in 10 minutes flat. He'd taken the trouble to learn the magic words, but he couldn't make them work, hence the bottle of stuff and the scraper. Half an hour of picking and worrying away at it, and he'd cleared a space the size of a wine bottle label. He wasn't sure when Karen would be back, but he was conscious of the need to get a move on. He dabbed on more of the stuff and scraped harder, with the result that he snapped the scrape blade, cut his thumb, jumped back in alarm and knocked over the stuff bottle, spilling the remaining contents into the sink. At least it hadn't gone all over the carpet tiles. Still, it was a pretty close approximation to a disaster, and for a while Chris stood there feeling sad, unable to think of anything he could do about it. Then a thought struck him. It was sheer desperation, but, well, the book had said they could anything. He retrieved the tape measure, ran out 9 inches of blade and, bending it slightly so it lay flush against the wall, stroked the half-soggy wallpaper with it. Instant success. It came away like shaving foam under a new razor blade. He tried it again. The next sweep cleaned off 3 square feet, leaving the plastered wall smooth and unmarked. At this rate, his inner accountant was totalling up the brownie points, and the result was staggering. If only he could contrive to get the whole job finished by the time she got back. Not implausible, at the rate the tape measure was going. Not only would he be forgiven for not being home in time to go socialising, but there'd be enough change left over to pay for at least 1, maybe 2 further mistakes. Right, he thought. The blade made a gentle hissing noise as it snow-ploughed through the paper, and the lack of stuff from the bottle didn't seem to make any difference at all. Magic, he assumed. How nice it must be, he thought, ever so slightly resentfully, to be able to do proper magic, like this, all the time. Magic to wash up and hoover, dust, scour ovens, wash cars. How useful. How convenient. Instead, all he got was demons and geometaphysical rifts, action-adventure stuff which scared him rigid and interfered with his chances of making his monthly target. Even the stuff he sold to the shops, well, it wasn't action-adventure, but a lot of it was just toys, junk, no practical application in the real world. Now, if only JWW Retail could come up with a line of genuinely useful consumer and household items. There was, Chris noticed, something written on the wall, under the archaeological strata of wallpaper layers. He could make out the top halves of a row of letters, big block capitals in blue chalk. Mildly intrigued, he scraped down a little further until he could read them. Danger. He frowned. Gas main? Electricity cable. Nice of whoever it was to mention it, but a little more information would have been helpful. He scraped a little further. You are in terrible danger. All right, he thought, but please be more specific. Do not drill here, or something like that. Also, terrible danger, as in bringing the whole wall down or frying himself to a crisp. He scraped down and got, trust no one. He stood back and scratched his head. A practical joking painter and decorator with a flair for melodrama. You included, he said aloud. Then with a shrug, scraped a bit more. Except me, obviously. He thought. Well, a practical joking painter and decorator with a flair for melodrama and delusions of humour might have guessed what a normal person's reaction might be. He was getting close to the bottom of the wall now, and had to stoop to scrape the next patch. The demons are hunting you. They will... Oh, shit, Chris thought. Let's see, he said to himself. We've been here, 4 years? We redid the bathroom when we moved in, but we were in a hurry, so we just papered over what was already there. And there's 4 layers, so that's our layer and 3 more, which means this lot's been here a long time, and there isn't any way of writing through waterproof vinyl wallpaper, in which case, this message can't be for me, can it? Well, he read it again. The demons are hunting you. They will... They will what? He got on his hands and knees and scraped right down to the skirting board. Continued on next wall. Fine. He went into the kitchen and fetched the folding steps and started scraping at the top of the right-hand wall. Hunt you down until they find you. They have already... He slipped on the top rung of the steps, dropped the tape measure and grabbed the wall with his left hand to steady himself. Then he looked down and saw, with a resigned, wretched feeling, that the tape measure had sliced the doors off the bathroom cabinet. Marvellous, he thought. If I wasn't in terrible danger before, I am now. Tried once. Next time I will not be there to save you. The one who is come must be protected at all costs. Only you can... Oh, for crying out loud, the telephone. Chris hopped off the ladder, carefully laid the tape measure on the floor, and scampered through into the hall. There's been a development, Jill's voice, sounding rattled. It's really weird. I can't... Not now, he thought. Look, Jill, could I call you back? Only I'm sort of up to my eyes right at this very moment. It's back. All right, then. What's back? The entity, she said. It's back inside your SatNav. We went to do a low-level demiurge scan on the casing, and it's definitely in there. Oh, he said. That's good, isn't it? Sort of. Definite hesitation in her voice. Only... The thing is, it sort of barricaded itself in, and we can't open it up. God only knows how it's doing it. Some kind of really powerful gatekeeper or portcullis charm. The energy drain must be off the scale, but it's managing it somehow. He thought for a bit, then said, Hardly surprising, though, is it? I mean, she must know that if you can crack the casing open, you're going to do nasty things to her for escaping. Not, he added quickly, that I've got any sympathy. I'm just saying, it's basic survival instinct, surely. I suppose, Jill replied. It's still crazy, though. For one thing, if it managed to get loose, why in heaven's name would it want to come back? It's like an escaped convict breaking back into prison. It doesn't make sense. She had a point, as always. Even so, he said, she's back under lock and key, so all's well that ends well. It's not as simple as that. In the first place, how did it get out? Second, how did it get back in again, and why? Third, how is it managing to keep us out, and how come a fairly low-grade entity like that's generating that kind of power? That jogged Chris's memory. Talking of which, he said, I meant to ask you, what is she exactly? I mean, you just keep saying the entity. Is she a demon or what? Jill sounded shocked. Oh no, nothing like that. Something pretty innocuous. Well, relatively. They can all be bloody dangerous if you aren't careful. No, it's just a plain ordinary dryad. No big deal. Or so you'd have thought. Fine. What the hell's a dryad? Oh, right. It's a nature spirit or genius loci, almost exclusively associated with forests. They live in trees and protect them from enemies. Basically, just an elf. Elf? Yes. For a moment, the word made no sense. Like Santa's little helpers, that sort of thing. No, Jill snapped impatiently. Tell you what, look it up. There's a very helpful guide to species recognition and characteristics on our website, www.delandescent, all one word, .gov.uk/entities. All you need to know in one handy, easy-to-access reference, all right? Just a tick. This pencil's not very... What was that word? Dylan. She spelt it out for him. Got that? Fine. Look, sorry, but I've got to dash. Just thought you'd like to know. One less thing to worry about. Well, for now, for you. Anyhow, an elf, Chris thought, as he put the phone down. She's an elf. He tried to picture an elf in his mind, but the image that presented itself didn't seem quite right. And he had a feeling he was probably getting elf muddled up with Smurf. Anyway, it didn't matter. If she was safely back in her casing, it was, as Jill had said, one less thing to stress out about. Talking of which, back into the bathroom, grab the tape measure, up the ladder, scrape and... You're back then? Good of you to spare the time. He sighed. I'm sorry, he said aloud. Now, you got as far as only you can bring the one that is to come across the interface. His arm was starting to get ever so tired. Is that right? He said. What interface? Scrape, 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 scrape. And who are you talking to, anyhow? Chris scowled. Just an old school friend, if it's any of your business. Look. The tape measure slipped out of his hand and slid down the wall, taking a great swathe of paper with it. Nice trick, he couldn't help but concede. You must set free the one who is cursed, rescue the one that is to come from those that are hidden, and end the war among the children of the dark. If you fail, you will die, and the human race will... Hang on, he panted, moving the stepladder. Okay, the human race will... perish. Everything depends on you. His right hand was starting to go numb. He rested it for 30 seconds, then scraped some more. I will help you, as I have always done. However, since... The tape measure slipped out of his hand again. This time, luckily, it missed the fixtures and fittings and flumped down on the floor. He snatched it up and... You missed a bit. He blinked, then looked up. Sure enough, there was a little patch of paper that had escaped the blade. He flicked it off, then went back to where he'd got to. Nothing there. He did the rest of the wall. Nothing. Just plain, uninscribed plaster as far as the eye could see. By the time Karen had got home, he'd done the whole of the bathroom, every last square centimetre. Also, he'd been over the whole lot with sandpaper and a wire brush to get off any loose plaster, he explained, and to make sure there was a firm surface for the new paper to stick to. She did manage to find fault with some dark, smeary marks, like badly erased chalk, but her heart clearly wasn't in it, and she barely sulked at all about him not being back by one as he'd promised. That night, Chris didn't sleep at all well. A dream kept going round in his head, repeating like a loop. There was the demon, edging towards him. In the dream it was light in the box formed by the faded car, and he could see it clearly. It crawled on all fours as far as his feet, then looked up at him with fiery orange eyes and whimpered, "Help me, please." As it said the words, a shadow fell across it so he couldn't see it anymore, and then an egg the size of a rugby ball split open, and SatNav jumped out, golden and shining, and said, "Leave her alone, she's just a baby," and then popped back into the egg, whose shell flew back into place like a rewound film. Then he stood up, and the egg was in his pocket, and it was saying, "At the end of the world, turn right." And then Jill popped up out of nowhere, grabbed him by the hair, and laid the blade of a tape measure across his throat, at which point he woke up. Being awake wasn't much better. He had that extra creepy feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a small child, that there was something in the room watching him. As if that wasn't enough to be going on with, something was nagging away at his mind, and he couldn't pin it down. Something to do with water polo and websites. When he drifted off to sleep, the dream came back again, waking him up, and so on. Chris spent Sunday hanging wallpaper, but no more messages came. Just after lunch, he got the book out and looked up Pantocops. Same entry as before, but he'd missed a bit where it said about the disorienting effect of handling such a powerful magical object if you weren't used to it. Delusions and hallucinations were common side effects, it said, and recommended the wearing of gloves, eye and ear protection, and a surgical mask. So maybe he'd imagined the whole thing, the writing on the wall, talking back to him. It was a comforting thought, and since he'd scrubbed away the chalk, if there had ever been any to start with, he had no verifiable evidence, or, in other words, nothing to contradict the must-have-imagined-it hypothesis. Magical radiation leaking out of the tape measure and driving him nuts. Add to that the delayed shock of his meeting with the demon, or had he imagined that too? No, because Jill had been to the car park and her instruments had picked up the burn of demonic body heat all over the place. So that had definitely happened, unfortunately. The dream was waiting for him as soon as he went to bed, and the pattern repeated as before. He woke up for the third time just after 3 a.m. and thought, to hell with this, I'll get up and make myself a cup of tea, and perhaps that'll disturb the cycle. It was while the kettle was boiling that the mystery resolved itself. It sort of popped out like a loose tooth. Where he'd been going wrong, of course, was water polo. Not water polo after all. What he should have been thinking about was polo shirts, to be precise, the one he'd been lent by the government man, with the letters DS on the pocket. Quietly as a little mouse, so as not to wake Karen, he crept into the living room, turned on the computer and plugged in the phone jack. www.delendicent, all one word. Eventually, the homepage of the Department of Metaphysics shimmered onto the screen, and there, in the top left-hand corner, was their departmental logo, a hand clutching a badly drawn sword, and under it a scroll with the words Delendi Sunt. Whatever that meant, but now at least he knew what DS stood for. Not that much of a mystery. Chris went back into the kitchen and made his cup of tea. Then, because he wasn't feeling sleepy anymore, he clicked on the links page to Supernatural Entities of the British Isles and scrolled down to Dryads. He read what it had to say, but there really wasn't anything that Jill hadn't already told him, so he switched off and disconnected. So she'd come home, had she? One less weirdness to worry about. Presumably they keep her there and find some way of breaking into the casing, and then dissect her or whatever you did with stroppy entities. He didn't feel terribly wonderful about that. But then, she'd tried to cut him open, hadn't she? In which case, serve her right. From there, his thoughts strayed to the demon itself. Logically, he supposed, he ought to be in a right old state about that. His escape had, after all, been as narrow as a country lane. If SatNav hadn't turned up when she did and chased the demon away, he was fairly sure it would have killed him, and it was still out there. And it had deliberately targeted him, going to all that trouble and effort. True, Now it knew that he didn't have the information it wanted, so presumably now it would leave him alone, go and hassle someone else. He remembered poor Mr. Newsom and winced, but even so, he couldn't help wondering, where is she? Odd question to ask. At the time, he'd been stone cold certain he didn't know the answer, and it was on that presupposition that his belief that he was now safely out of it rested. But suppose he did have the answer, but without knowing it. Possible, since he hadn't got a clue who she was. He did know a fair number of women, after all, and one of them could be the person the demon was after. Could be Jill, for example. Or anybody. Karen, Angela the trainee. All this stuff had only started when she arrived in his life. Julie at the office. Karen's cousin Melanie. Anybody at all. Until he could be absolutely certain that he didn't know the answer to the demon's question, it really wouldn't do to get complacent. Well, fine. Now he had something to worry himself sick about all over again. Very well done indeed, but without knowing who she was, he had no way at all of either setting his mind at rest or confirming that he was squarely in the demon's crosshairs. Naturally, he'd told Jill all about what the demon had asked. She just frowned, then shrugged. No suggestions or explanations, and she was the only person he could think of who might possibly know. So, dead end. Chris picked up his teacup and noticed it had left a ring on the cover of the book. The book. Supremely advanced technology, but a total dead loss commercially, because it told you what you needed to know, not what you wanted to know. Well, he thought, if ever there was a case of genuine, not to say desperate need, surely this was it. He shifted the cup to the table, rested the book on his knees and opened it, as stated in the instructions, at random. Gandhi. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, born 2nd of October 1869. Porbandar, India. He used a word his mother wouldn't have liked and closed the book. No wonder they couldn't give the bloody things away. It crossed his mind that the demon was simply behind the times and not particularly well up in current affairs. But it had specifically said she, not he, so that ruled Gandhi out as the object of its search. He yawned and went back to bed, and dreamed he was back at school and having to do the reading in assembly with no clothes on, which, compared to the dreams he'd been having lately, was practically a lullaby. I heard about what happened, said Angela the trainee, as they drove through the outskirts of Telford. It must have been terrible. She really did have a little Suzuki Jeep, which showed the sort of attention to detail that demons were capable of, but they'd picked up on things like the US out of Kiribati now sticker in the back window, and the door compartment stuffed full of used tissues. You had to admire good field work. He had to admit, though, the demon Angela had been a much better driver. Oh, Chris said. Who told you? The government people rang to find out where I was, she explained. Mummy answered. She told them that I'd been in my room all day. They told her. She went to change up into 3rd and got 5th instead. Sounds like you were really lucky. I was, he said. I'm pretty sure it'd have killed me if... He hesitated. Had the government people told her about SatNav's intervention? Probably not. An escaped SatNav entity was just the sort of thing they'd classify on general principles. He considered telling her anyway, but decided against it. Too much background to explain, and he didn't feel like going into all that. I was going to ask you, Angela said, as she swung out to overtake an ambling JCB. The brave little engine whinnied as she flogged it. How did you get away? I don't know, he replied. There was this strap thing holding me in where the seatbelt had been, and it suddenly sort of gave way, and I fell out, and there I was on the tarmac back in the real world. Otherwise, well, it doesn't bear thinking about, really. He had hoped that would end the inquiry, but apparently not. That's odd, she said, because if they took you into their dimension, presumably they'd be using a level 7 containment spell to keep you there, and that's what would have been holding you down, and something like that wouldn't just break of its own accord. I mean, either they must have released it or something else must have disrupted it, one or the other. Is that right? Chris said uneasily. Lucky for me, whatever it was. There was definitely something very different about Angela today. It wasn't just that she was chattier, friendlier, more relaxed, less sullen and withdrawn. The way she looked had changed too. She looked, well, the difference between scragend of lan and words is that words are better unminced. She looked nicer, lots nicer. All the sharp edges seemed to have gone from her face. There was a bit of colour in her cheeks. If he didn't know better, he could have sworn she'd filled out a bit. The result wasn't bad, actually, though of course that was none of his business. Even so, he couldn't help glancing sideways while she was busy not mashing up a cyclist into the side of a parked van. Makeup? He couldn't see any, but he was no expert. Makeup, he thought. We sell that. Instaglamour cream, available in 4 handy sizes. One of the few advantages that the JWW product had over its rivals, one which he kept on forgetting to mention when he was pitching it in the shops, was that it didn't just spruce up the way you looked. It improved your personality as well. Your voice sounded nicer. People believed what you told them. Your jokes were suddenly funny. You were generally more fun to be with, though of course you had to be careful not to overdo it, as Tony Blair had found to his cost. Still, it worked, which was more than could be said of everything in the JWW range. It was like the old hairspray commercial. Was she or wasn't she? Hard to tell. If she was, it could only have been a little bit, a quick dab on each cheek and the tip of the nose, but that was what they recommended in the little leaflet. Just a little to start with, or people would notice, and gradually work your way up. Or maybe she was just that much more relaxed, or something had happened to put her in a good mood, and without the spiky attitude, he was seeing her as she really was. Maybe it was just because she was driving her own car rather than being driven in someone else's. Whatever. It meant that today promised to be a slightly less wearing day than Thursday, and that couldn't be bad. Is this the right road? Angela asked. I don't know this area. Chris nodded. Straight on till you come to a T-junction. For some reason, his voice faltered as he said it. Then left and immediately right. Thank you. She flicked her hair away from her face. I've got a rubbish sense of direction. What I could do with is one of those SatNav things. The tone of voice so carefully pitched, but still not good enough. He felt as though someone was running a wire brush over the soles of his feet. They're all right, he said, but it doesn't do good to rely on them. Really? I'd heard they were pretty good. They can let you down, he replied. You're better off with a map. Not always true, he reflected, thinking of the jinxed map that had taken him to the Ettingate retail park. Basically, you couldn't trust anything, and then he remembered that a wall had recently told him that, and he'd been trying so hard not to think about it. They'd come to call on Mercy and Magic, one of his better customers. Whether or not the managers fancied him, as some of the unkinder voices in the office had been heard to suggest, they always ordered in well on the new lines and, to do them justice, managed to get rid of them. Properly speaking, it wasn't the right day, but he'd phoned ahead, and yes, they could see him at 9:40, a nice easy call, he'd promised himself, to ease himself back into the swing. As Chris got out, he felt his phone clunk against something in his jacket pocket. The tape measure, just to make him feel a tiny bit more secure. Tell you what, he said, as they walked up to the shop door, I'll start off with the usual stuff, and then you can pitch them the new lines, if you feel like it, of course. He had no idea why he'd offered, but Angela squealed, "Oh, yes, please," before he could come up with a viable weaseling out strategy. So that was that. You do know about the... She nodded. "I've been reading up on our product portfolio," she said. "Which one do you most want to shift?" "BB27K," he said immediately. "No need to think about that." She smiled. "Well, if they want a testimonial, you can honestly say they work." Maybe I liked her better when she was sullen, Chris said to himself, and pushed open the door. There was some man he didn't know behind the counter. A big, square man who looked like a builder. "Hello," he said. "I'm here to see Christine." The man looked at him. "Rep." "That's right. Chris Popham, JWW Retail, and this is my associate, Angela." Screw it, he couldn't remember her surname. "This is my associate, Angela," made her sound like a faded blonde in fishnets who passed him the top hat with the rabbit in it and got sawn in half. Still. "Christine's left," the man said, with just a hint of smugness. "I'm the new manager, John Iconojewel." "Ah." Briefly disconcerted, but a good recovery, Chris held out his hand, which Mr. Iconojewel apparently failed to see. "Please to..." "You want down in the book," Mr. Iconojewel said. Chris smiled feebly. "Well, it's not actually my usual day, but I did phone through." Mr. Iconojewel frowned, held up a hand as though commanding a dog to sit, scrabbled in a small sheaf of bits of paper, found one, smoothed it out, and scowled at it. "All right," he said. "Stupid girl took the message. Can't read her writing. So this is you, then?" "I suppose it must be," Chris said. It was supposed to be airy banter, but it came out sounding half-witted. "Look, if it's not convenient, I can come back." "That'd be a bit pointless since you're here," Mr. Iconojewel said, raising an eyebrow. "You better make it quick, though. I've got sober work coming in at 10. A good pitch is a thing of light and air, a gossamer light touch on the customer's heart and mind. The tone is brisk but chatty, posited on the assumption that of course the customer wants as much of this excellent merchandise as the seller can spare him. Fortunately, since he's a favoured client and a personal friend, he can usually be accommodated. Phrases like, 'This is going to do really well for you,' and 'I think this is exactly what you've been looking for,' should dart out like white doves from the magician's hat, inspiring the client, making him feel good about his commercial judgment and breadth of vision. Businesslike, to be sure, but not so intense that negotiations can't be put on hold for 5 minutes while conversation is made about the wife's back, the daughter's GCSE grades, the football, or the number of VAT inspectors required to change a light bulb. This pitch wasn't like that. Chris could feel himself wallowing like a car stuck in mud, and the harder he revved his charm, the more the wheels span. Mr. Iconojewel wasn't interested in JWW's new improved bottled dreams or the Haitian surprise melting wax pins sold separately. All he wanted was another 9 dozen of the DW6, and he kept glancing down at his watch. Desperation time. "In that case," Chris said, "my colleague would like it if you could spare her a minute of your time to hear about our new line in portable folding parking spaces. Angela?" Such a difference. For the first 30 seconds, he was stunned, then furiously jealous. Then he pulled himself together and started paying close attention, in the hope of learning how it was done. That didn't do him much good. Angela was brisk but chatty, rewriting the rules of engagement so that she was the one doing the customer a favour, businesslike but not intense, pausing for digressions on house prices, ice hockey and reality TV. When she finally released him, she'd got an order for 8 dozen BB27 Kias and helped him see the error of his ways about the bottled dreams, the melting wax and the miracle sprout padded insoles. Guaranteed to leave a trail of spring flowers wherever you walk, may contain traces of chlorophyll. "Is that the time?" she said. "We'd better leave it there for now. Didn't you say you'd got Zauberwerk coming in at 10? Mr. Iconojule gave her a slightly dazed look.
"Forgotten about him?"
he mumbled.
"Sod it, yes. Not sure why I'm even bothering. They've never got anything worth having."
And Chris thought, that settles it. Instaglamour cream, which is unethical and banned, and if she gets caught selling to the customers with it on, it'll be me that gets a bollocking. On the other hand... Thanks, Angela said, as they left the shop. That was fun. I can see how you get a sort of rush out of doing this. There was a jar of it, he remembered, in his sample case. Just a tiny little smudge on the tip of his nose and the point of his chin. Nobody would ever know. She opened the car door for him, and he climbed in and pulled down the seat belt, ready to clip it on. The feel of the webbing was unpleasantly familiar. The demons had copied that exactly too. He could remember how it had buckled as he drove his fingernails into it. Where to next? Angela was saying, asking him for directions. You know, as in, at the end of the road, turn. It took him a moment to get his mind back. It had strayed off like a bad dog.
"Back on the ring road," he said, "and then we want the B194 as far as..."
Chris was pretty sure what she'd done. The question was, why? It made no sense. There were all sorts of reasons why someone would want to daub on the Instaglamour. It could get you love, popularity, the trust of the electorate, though the discerning buyers in Hollywood, Westminster and DC tended to go for Zauberwerks like me, 20% more effective and without the unfortunate dermatological side effects. It could make you adored, worshipped, revered. It could even shift BB27Ks, though of course you weren't supposed to do that. But why should Angela the trainee put the stuff on just to spend a day doing the rounds with him? If she'd read the little booklet that came inside the box, she must have seen the dire warnings section. Apply not more than once every 10 days. Remove with JWW glamour off within 6 hours. Failure to observe safety precautions may result in lasting physical and spiritual damage or death, and that's if you're lucky. The natural assumption was that she wanted him to like her, or she was anxious to make a good impression on the customers. But neither of those would wash. After all, she was trainee management, graduate entry, being put through uni by the firm because they believed she was destined for greatness. She had no reason to be interested in anything here. She was just passing through because she'd been ordered to, and it didn't matter whether anybody liked her or not, or whether she impressed some underachieving rep who'd never make it off the road and into management. As for, well, a personal as opposed to a business motive, he was inclined to doubt that, in the same way that he was sceptical about the sun being a fiery chariot drawn by milk-white horses, in which case... She was telling him about someone she'd met who'd actually met someone who knew Morrissey. He suppressed a frown. That was first date chatter, and besides, she didn't seem to be giving her full attention to the traffic and other road users, in which case, for some reason Chris couldn't begin to guess at, he'd recently become special, an object of interest to a community he'd only vaguely heard of until they started popping up all around him, ripping off heads, hitching rides in his car, kidnapping him and asking him weird questions. Was it logical to assume that he was caught up simultaneously in more than one strange and inexplicable sequence of events? Not really. But consider the facts. Angela the trainee had come into his life on the insistence of his boss, Mr. Bernard's, crass, prosaic, insensitive, perhaps most annoying man he'd ever met in his entire life, but nevertheless safe. He simply couldn't imagine him being mixed up with demons or even demon hunting. Mr. Bernard's was a simple man. He existed only to supervise the exchange of goods and money, and anything that didn't directly concern that process was as alien and irrelevant to him as a Rachmaninoff piano concerto to a Trobriand fisherman. And, not just presumably, but as a matter of record, Mr. Bernard knew Angela, had known her some time as a friend of the family, probably given her a vague smile as she sulked at dinner parties. Mr. Bernard's proved that she existed, that she was a real person with a family and a history, therefore not a demon-wrought illusion. By implication, he vouched for her. And although there were times when he'd gladly have fed Mr. Burnot's to a tank full of piranhas, Chris was prepared to take his unspoken word on something like this. Maybe he should ask Jill what she thought, but that didn't feel right somehow. He could see the look on her face, the twitch of an eyebrow, the expression that said, "You know perfectly well why, and please bear in mind that Karen's my friend too." And it wasn't like that. He was prepared to bet money on it, but that'd be the conclusion she would jump to, if only because it was a perfectly reasonable one, to an outsider who wasn't there to see for herself. And the scary coincidence is, Angela was saying, that a friend of my dad's was at college with a girl who went out for a while with a man who used to work for the same company that did the lighting at a gig in Preston, where the warm-up band had once... "Look out!" Chris yelled. Poor road skills, but top-notch reflexes. She dragged the wheel round, nearly crunching the Jeep into the crash barrier, but avoiding the oncoming lorry by at least 1/4 of a millimetre. A horn doppled away behind them. She straightened up and went on. Been on tour with Morrissey back in the 90s. Well, when I say on tour, they did a couple of gigs with him in Scotland, I think. But even so, it just goes to show it's a pretty small world. Chris was forgetting to do something. To breathe. He gobbled a double ration of air and made his hand let go of the seat belt. "Is that right?" he whimpered. "Like you say, it only..." He forgot the rest of what he'd been going to say. He was staring down at his left hand, slowly unclenching from around the seat belt, a habit of his, purely unconscious, when he encountered lethal danger as a passenger on the road. He'd done it only yesterday, tearing a fingernail as he dug his nails into the canvas while the demon prowled around him, and again just now when he'd grabbed a handful and squeezed, but not dug his nails in. He was pretty sure about that. There hadn't been time. And his fingers were still sore from yesterday. So instinctively he'd squeezed instead of digging, a personal choice and equally valid. In which case, though? He glanced quickly across to make sure Angela wasn't looking, then down at the belt to confirm. In which case, why were there nail marks, deep and crisp and even, scored into the webbing at precisely the point on the belt where he'd just grabbed it? So was it the same Jeep? Is Angela involved? Ooh, has Mr. Burnot's, has he been put under a spell to remember Angela when he doesn't? Dun dun dun. Who knows? Who can tell? We'll just have to keep listening to find out. Okay, so I'm going to try and do another chapter later on. I'm so sorry. As we're trying to have a conversation, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, you must think I am such a dork. Hey, I'm a nerd and proud, it's fine. But, oh my goodness, now I'm having giggles. Right, grown-up time. So, yes, it's all getting a little bit lively, isn't it? Breathe! Oh my goodness, but I digress. I'm going to try and do another chapter later on, and I'll do it as an instant premiere like this one, so you'll know it's there. If I don't get a chance to, I'll definitely do another one tomorrow. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know how things are going, and let me know you're all right. If you've got a minute to spare to do so, that'd be brilliant. I'd appreciate that. But as ever, if I could ask you to just hit that like button or notifications bell, that's always a massive help. And share and subscribe if you want to, but you don't have to if you don't want to. It's all good. I just appreciate you being here. You're all awesome, and I hope you have a fantastic day, night, evening, morning, afternoon, whenever it is, really. Big love, take it easy, and speak to you soon, Petal. Oh, and I nearly forgot. See you soon.